Hello, my name is Anthony Tran, and this is the Unkown Military History podcast. This is the first episode of a series known as the Wars of the Diadochi, which describe the conflicts and civil wars of Alexander the Great's generals. Let us now travel back to the ancient world where our story takes place. It was June 10th, 323 BC. In the ancient city of Babylon, numerous men stood and waited with anticipation inside the palace of a long-gone king named Nebuchadnezzar II. Within that palace, a young man lay on his deathbed. Alongside him were his subordinates and friends. The young man pulled out his signet ring. As he whispered his last words, he handed the ring to one of his men. The young man then gave a final shudder, leaving the mortal world. That young man had, in his 12-year reign, conquered the known world with military genius unlike anything the world had thus seen or would ever see. This young man had brought the Macedonian Greeks to the edge of the known world. He had smashed Persian armies more than twice his size at battles such as Issus and Gaugamela. He had ingeniously used the limited resources of his small kingdom to conquer the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Invading the borders of India, he won great victories further than those of his time would dare dream of. This young conqueror would go down in history as Alexander the Great. However, as Alexander entered Babylon to plan future conquests, he would not have realized that this ancient city would be where he would breathe his last. When Alexander crossed the Tigris River to prepare for the entry of Babylon, he had met with several local Chaldean soothsayers. The soothsayers warned Alexander about entering Babylon during that time. They stated that the god Bel had spoken to them in warning, and that they would warn Alexander. Speaking further, the soothsayers warned Alexander against marching westwards, because he would then look to the setting sun, which was a symbol of death and decline. Alexander was suggested by the soothsayers to enter Babylon via the royal gate in the western wall. Alexander took this route. However, the path was filled with dirty swamps, filled with mosquitoes. When Alexander finally entered Babylon, he threw a grand feast with his friends and generals in the palace of the ancient Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. As Alexander feasted, he picked up a large bowl of unmixed wine. Raising a toast to the mythological hero Hercules, whom he supposedly was descended from, he drank from the bowl. Almost suddenly, Alexander was suddenly struck with pain. He fell to the ground, helped by his soldiery to a bed. For the next 11 days, Alexander struggled between life and death, before he finally succumbed to death itself and died. What was strange was that Alexander did not develop a fever. His cause of death remains unknown even to the modern day. Various theories about his death have been made, from assassination, overdrinking, disease that he may have caught wading among the swamps of Babylon, or even as a result of his battle wounds over the years. What was more important, though, was the aftermath of Alexander's death. When Alexander was dying, his generals asked him whom was to rule the vast empire he left behind. Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant, but had not borne a son yet, while Alexander's half-brother Philip Arrhidaeus was mentally ill. However, Alexander turned to a stern man next to him, gave him his ring, turned to the rest of the generals and stated, "To the strongest." He then breathed his last. The man that Alexander had given his signet ring to was named Perdiccas. Born of a noble Macedonian family, Perdiccas had joined the Macedonian army early on. During Alexander's conquest of the rebellious city of Thebes, Perdiccas has distinguished himself as a commander of the Macedonian infantry. During Alexander's conquest of Persia and invasion of India, Perdiccas had risen through the ranks to serve as one of Alexander's important generals. When Alexander's best friend and fellow general Hephaestion passed away, it was Perdiccas whom Alexander appointed as commander of his elite companion cavalry, and it had been Perdiccas whom Alexander gave his ring to. Alexander's generals, including Perdiccas, met each other to discuss their plans. Perdiccas spoke first, proposing that since Alexander had given him the ring, they would all wait until Alexander's wife bore a son. In the meantime, Perdiccas would serve as regent of the empire. However, there were those who resisted Perdiccas' plan due to old rivalries. Since Alexander's conquest of Persia, there had been enmity growing amongst some of the generals toward each other. This all came to a head now. Meleager, an experienced general, objected to Perdiccas alongside his supporters. Meleager was the most experienced general still alive besides that of Antipater, the current regent of Macedon. Meleager had fought alongside Alexander at both Issus and Gaugamela, and was a well-respected and seasoned veteran. Meleager, viewing Perdiccas' ambitions as a threat, divided his plan to become the regent of Alexander's wife Roxanne and his unborn son. Instead, Meleager and his followers would choose to declare for either Alexander's mentally ill half-brother Philip Arrhidaeus or Alexander's bastard son Heracles, rather than wait for the birth of Alexander's legitimate son. Already, the empire that Alexander had built was beginning to fracture. Meleager, assuming leadership of the opposition against Perdiccas, declared for Arrhidaeus. Taking advantage of the dire situation, Meleager abruptly ordered for the execution of Perdiccas, accusing him of treachery against the declared king Arrhidaeus. However, this was not to be. Perdiccas was a popular general, especially among the ranks of the companion cavalry whom he had led. Perdiccas thus gathered his supporters and camped outside of Babylon. The empire's fate now rested in a tense standoff, neither side willing to make the first move. However, a man named Eumenes came forth. Eumenes was a native of the region of Cardia, which was subordinate territory to the Macedonian Empire. Eumenes had served for years as the private secretary of both Philip II and his son Alexander. Now, as the empire was on the brink of civil war, Eumenes met with both Perdiccas and Meleager to negotiate favorable terms with both of the top generals. After this meeting, Meleager and Perdiccas declared that royal authority would be divided between Arrhidaeus and Alexander's expected son. Meleager would assume the title of co-regent alongside Perdiccas. If that was to be the end of the short-lived conflict, it only escalated things even further. Perdiccas and Meleager had already hated each other, and it would be Perdiccas who made the first move. Meleager, being lulled into a false sense of security after their agreement, took little notice as Perdiccas began to influence the generals and Arrhidaeus himself. One day, the generals and the common soldiery met under Arrhidaeus and Perdiccas. Arrhidaeus then made the announcement demanding the surrender as well as the punishment of all mutineers. Under Perdiccas' command, 300 alleged mutineers of the infantry who were subordinate to Meleager were rounded up and executed. Realizing he was trapped, Meleager fled the site. Perdiccas and his troops were close behind. Reaching a local temple, Meleager sought refuge. However, Perdiccas' men broke into the temple, dragging Meleager out. Accused of instigating a mutiny, Meleager was executed on Perdiccas' orders. Meleager's death would be the first of many to come. Perdiccas was now the sole regent of the empire following his struggle with Meleager. Using his authority, Perdiccas summoned the top generals of the empire in Babylon, asking them which provinces they would be governed. However, 3 prominent generals were not at Babylon. Antipater, the longtime regent of Macedon, was in the capital city of Pella in mainland Greece. Several months before his sudden death, Alexander had summoned Antipater to Babylon to replace him with a man named Craterus. However, Antipater suspected that Alexander was planning to kill him, so he instead sent his son Cassander, who now lingered around in Babylon. Alexander had actually been seeking to replace Antipater with a man named Craterus, who is presently on his way to mainland Greece with a fellow general named Polyperchon. Another notable absence to the Council of Babylon was Antigonus the One-Eyed, the governor of Phrygia and a seasoned veteran of Alexander's conquest of Persia. Despite this, the meeting continued. with what would become known as the Partition of Babylon taking place, with the appointed governors becoming known as satraps. Antipater and Antigonus currently kept their respective provinces in Macedon and Phrygia. Cratylus was allowed to jointly rule alongside Antipater in Macedon. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's childhood friends and a veteran at the Battle of Issus, was able to ask for and receive the governorship of the lucrative province of Egypt. Meanwhile, a general known as Lysimachus received the province of Thrace, which was ever prone to raids by local tribes and rebellions. Python, one of Alexander's prominent bodyguards, received the province of Media, which connected the trade routes between east and west. Other important generals would receive the various far-flung eastern provinces and Syrian provinces. In the east, Alexander's former foe and the current client king Porus retained his Indian kingdom. During the course of this partition, Alexander's wife Roxanne would finally bear a son. He was named Alexander IV of Macedon. All the problems of Alexander's succession seemed to have been solved. However, this was just the beginning of a long struggle, for the death of Alexander had weakened the regent Antipater's hold on the Greek city-states. Now, as the empire divided, a rebellion began. I would like to thank you, personally, for listening to this episode of Unknown Military History. This podcast wouldn't exist if it wasn't for your support, and for now, stay tuned for the next episode.